Okay, can we start, Prasanna? Okay, yeah.
We'll proceed, sir.
Sure, yeah. Good evening to all. I'd like to welcome all of you for this seminar being organized by Madras Institute of Development Studies. Let me give you a small background. If you look at the empirical studies, we widely use secondary data and primary data. Of late, we are using experimental data, which are again primary in nature. Most of the secondary data are indeed primary data collected through primary surveys, household surveys, individual surveys, etc. And when we conduct primary surveys, we encounter with a whole lot of problems. Indeed, there is a book by Mitchell Carson and Mitchell and Carson, Robert Mitchell and Richard Carson. This book is about the survey methods actually. In that book, they have listed out around 18 different biases and errors that affect the quality of data that we collect from primary surveys. So therefore, these biases and errors affect the validity and reliability of the data. While validity being the accuracy of the data, error-free data, and reliability being the kind of, how the data is getting replicated in other contexts, right? So these are the major issues that would, the validity and reliability issues that would affect the kind of quality of the results, and then the predictions that are being made out of these results actually, right? But in the Indian context, many organizations, both government organizations, academic organizations, we collect primary data, but we don't seem to be worried too much about the validity and reliability. I have been doing survey for the past 25 years. And, in almost all surveys, I have encountered with too many problems, especially in eliciting the valid and reliable data from the households actually. So therefore, we need to be kind of very serious about the methodology that's being deployed to collect primary data actually. And so in this talk, Dr. Rosa is going to focus mainly on the methodology, basically how the kind of elicitation of data from the respondents will get affected by some of the biases like the framing effect, the information effect. For example, when we talk about 18 different types of biases and errors, they are basically arising from the kind of information that we provide to the people and the frame in which we provide this information to the people. And then we have interviewer bias, we have strategic bias, hypothetical bias, scope effect, sequencing bias, whatnot. So we have plenty of these kinds of biases which need to be taken care of adequately while collecting the primary data. So therefore, Dr. Rosa is going to talk about how the framing effect, the information effect are indeed influencing the data being elicited from the households, as well as she will be talking about various analytical aspects related to the labor force, especially female labor force participation. Right? So I would like to welcome Dr. Rosa, and Dr. Rosa is right now an assistant professor at Azim Premji University, and she got her PhD from ISEC, Institute for Social and Economic Change, and She worked on the economic determinants and impacts of informal employment in India for her PhD thesis. She has a master's in development economics from University of Bath, UK, and she has had experience as a data analyst and quantitative modelers at Azim Premji University. She was a consultant at Analytics Training Institute and Seva Bharat. And she was also a senior research associate at Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology Environment, which is called ATRI in Bangalore. And she worked as a lecturer at Madras School of Economics in Chennai. And right now, she is the member, state Kerala State Planning Board, that is since 2021. She's a member in a subcommittee on women and employment, and she has published 2 books and then many research articles, as well as articles in various newspapers to disseminate the research results to the general public and all. So I would like to welcome Dr. Rosa, and thank you, Dr. Rosa, for having kindly agreed to deliver this talk. Thank you so much. Now the floor is yours. And I would request the participants to keep your questions, so that you can ask these questions at the end of the presentation. And if you feel that these questions are very heavy and you can't hold them, then you please put them in the chat box. At the end of the talk, we will summarize them, and then Dr. Rosa will be responding to these questions. So thank you so much, Dr. Rosa, please.
Thank you, Professor Venkatachalam. Thank you to MIDS for the opportunity to present this work. So I also just want to provide a little bit of a context. So I was also aware that MIDS was also sort of leading the Tamil Nadu household surveys. And I thought that it would be interesting to kind of exchange some of our findings from the measurement of women's work and how our experiences from conducting our own very small scale primary survey, not to the same extent that you're doing in Tamil Nadu. So yeah, it's really an opportunity for me to kind of share some of our findings and also receive feedback based on your own experiences as well. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Please go ahead. We could see that.
Okay. Yeah. So this is basically, as Professor Venkatachalam said, a question, a seminar really on the methodologies of conducting primary surveys with a specific focus on the measurement of women's work. And so broadly, it's titled, Who is Asked What? The Effect of Respondent Identity and Question Framing on Estimates of Women's Employment. And this is based on a 2-stage survey that we had undertaken at the Center for Sustainable Employment in Azim Premji University in 2021. So this is joint work with the collaborators on this survey, Rahul, Nishat, and Hema. Nishat is also here, so I welcome her to jump in if there are if she wants to add things in terms of questions, responding to questions. So what I would like to just kind of caveat before I go into the meat of this is that what we have looked at is, does it matter who is being asked questions on employment, and does it matter what is being asked? So these were the sort of 2 things that we were looking at. The focus of this will both of this, but I will also admit that the what part has been less studied by us. There's still more work to be done on that. I mean, all of this is still work in progress, so I do welcome your comments and insights. So as you all know, and I think this is now fairly common knowledge now, that female workforce participation in India is extremely low. And there's been a number of reasons being proposed for this and investigated and examined. So on the one hand, there's supply side norms. So there are social norms, there are safety restrictions, there are just lack of access and lack of mobility to women, the burden of care, all of which prevent women or discourage women from entering into paid employment. And on the demand side, there are also literature to show that there is just not adequate good jobs being created, especially in the context of increasing education and employment, education and for women. Good jobs, in a sense, has not been created that matches up with the educational attainment of women. So broadly, that has been the main focus of literature, which looks at why female workforce participation is low. But there is also another strand which says that actually women's work is not being properly measured. And one of these startling statistics, if you look at the periodic labor force survey estimates of employment, for example, it says that in Bihar, for example, the share of women of working age who are actually participating in paid employment is only 4%, which is really a bizarre number when you think about it, that only 4 out of 100 women of working age are actually employed, in a sense, and doing productive work. So we wanted to investigate this question of, so there is some literature which says that there is inadequate measurement of women's work, and this comes up because we are not asking the right thing. So what is being asked is probably in question. This is because the boundaries around which employment and work have been defined in the system of national accounting as well as in ILO frameworks often restricts the kind of activities that are captured. But even if you remain within that sphere, some of that activities is still not being captured by our employment surveys. It also matters how it is being asked. So in this, the literature talks about what is the reference period that you use. Are you asking about yesterday? Are you asking about last week? Are you asking about the majority of the year? This can also influence the measurement of women's work. And the other aspect is who is being asked. Are you going to ask the household head, which is what typically most surveys do? Or are you asking the respondent themselves? And that could matter also in the estimation of women's work specifically. So I'm going to focus in this presentation on the two aspects, which is how is it being asked and who is it being asked. So on the literature on how it is being asked, there has been extensive work in the international context, particularly led by ILO, which has actually conducted several experiments in many countries, especially in the developing country context, to see, well, does it matter, like Professor Venkatachalam said, the sequencing of questions, what comes asked first, and what is the order in which recall is being asked, does that matter? And they've conducted many experiments and provided flowcharts of questions that can better estimate employment. In the Indian context, there has been some work that NCER has done, led by Shanal Desai and Santanu Deshmukh, and they found that how they, instead of asking a household or instead of asking a person, were you employed? How they approached it was that they asked, what are the sources of this household's income? And then after identifying the sources of income, they would ask, well, who contributed to this particular income source? So who helped in that farm or business, if they said the main source of income was agriculture? So when you approach it from major sources of income and who contributed to that income, that was also getting better estimates of women's participation in employment. Ashwini Deshpande and Naila Kabir also have a more recent work which looks in the context of West Bengal, that they identify that there are fuzziness in the boundaries of paid and domestic work. And actually a lot of women are engaged in work which is actually expenditure saving. So they are making goods at home, which are then used for own use, which may have saved expenditure in terms of maybe making jaggery at home. But these are typically not captured by a lot of labor force surveys as well. On the literature on who is being asked, there's actually far less limited work on this. And broadly, I categorize this literature into 3 types. So there is, of course, an overarching framework that when individuals report on behalf of others, that's what we call as proxy reporting, there is likely to be some difference in what the self-reported estimates are versus what the proxy-reported estimates are. And the literature on this has broadly looked at the differences in self and proxy reporting in 3 domains. One of this is in autonomy and decision-making and asset ownership. So Ambler et al. In the context of Bangladesh, as well as Kilik in the context of Malawi, find that when husbands are reporting about wives' ownership of assets, they actually report less ownership of assets and less joint ownership, whereas wives indicate that they have more ownership and more joint ownership of assets. Another domain where the self-proxy mismatch comes through is in the measurement of child labor statistics. So Galdo, for instance, finds that in the Ethiopian context, the Janssen paper, for instance, finds that in the Tanzanian context, if children themselves are asked about whether they are engaged in employment versus asking a household head, you actually increase the estimates of child labor by between 35 to 60%. In the Ethiopian context, interestingly, they also find not only is there an increase in the estimates of child labor, they are finding that this increases particularly for young girls. So boys' child labor doesn't go underreported when it's proxy reported, but it's girls' work that is going underreported as well. And finally, in the question that I'm looking at, which is the proxy reporting of employment, there is some limited work, again in the Ethiopian context by Bardazi and all, who find that actually women tend to over-report their husband's work. There is a more recent paper in the Indian context by Kapoor et al. Who look at a few urban centers around India, and they look at proxy reporting and find that women's work tends to be underreported. But this paper has some issues in terms of how they're identifying proxy reporting, and I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion if needed. Broadly, again, in the proxy and self-reporting framework, Ambler et al. Identify this 3 kinds of errors that can come in when people are reporting on behalf of others. So one is, of course, a random measurement error. This could come because you are, as a respondent, you are paired with an enumerator who may not be as good as their job compared to another enumerator, right? So there's no systematic biases happening. It's a completely random measurement error that comes, and that could be one of the outcomes of could be one of the ways in which self-reporting differs from proxy reporting. Another kind of error that Ambler et al. Identify is asymmetric measurement error. So asymmetric measurement error could come if there are some systematic differences between men and women in their reporting of, in our case, employment. So why would this come? So this could come if men systematically are different from women in their understanding of employment. So and the reason, so that it is also possible, and there are studies to say that when women talk about employment and when they talk about their employment, often even though they are doing economic activities which are productive and producing goods for sale, they often don't identify that as employment. Whereas when the men are engaging in that work, that is identified as employment. So there can be systematic definitional differences or different understandings of employment by men and women, which means that, again, when they report on behalf of other people or when they report on behalf of themselves as well, they can be systematically different compared to the other person's reporting of that. It could also be social norms and social desirability bias. So there is always this understanding that men have to be the breadwinner, women are homemakers, and this could apply both for men and women as well, where women could also internalize a lot of these norms. And so there is also a resistance in that sense to report them as working in many cases. So there's a bias against indicating that women are employed. So then it could be likely that men underreport women's work as well, so as to keep up with certain social norms. Another form of error that Ambler et al. Identify is asymmetric information error. So asymmetric information error doesn't come really from a cognitive bias or a different definitions of work, but rather it's just that the self and the proxy have access to different information sources. And this could happen if the work that is being reported about is marginal, is interspersed with other kinds of work, if the person who's reporting is often not at home, if they're at a distance from each other, in a very spatial and literal sense, there could always be limited access to information for the proxy about that respondent. So that could also lead to some kind of differences between self and proxy reporting. So broadly in this context, what we try to do with our survey, it was one part of the survey, was to ask, who is being asked and how does that affect employment estimates. So does proxy reporting affect labor force estimates? What kinds of employment show a disagreement between self and proxy? And we also try to look at what are the characteristics that correlate with this disagreement. So that is the who part of it. And the what in that context, we're asking, how does the framing of the question change employment estimates? So does how we ask in terms of what is the reference period and how are we collecting this information, does that also affect difference in employment estimates? So so this was basically one of the main research questions with the India Working Survey. So this is the primary survey that I talked about. So this was a two-state survey conducted in Karnataka and Rajasthan. And our overarching research question was to understand how social identities, including the identity of gender, caste, and religion, affect labor market outcomes. So one arm of this survey was to look at labor market outcomes from the point of just the measurement of work. So how does gender affect the measurement of work? That was one of the research questions that we were looking at as part of this India Working Survey. So the survey was conducted in the months of February and March, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we had to prematurely terminate it. So because of this, although it was intended to be state representative, these are not state representative data. So these are partial data. For Karnataka and Rajasthan, we have about 6,000 individuals and we interviewed about 3,600 households during these 2 months. Again, because it was sort of prematurely terminated, it is a predominantly rural sample. So we had to stop before we could cover much of urban areas. And this is a collaborative project between APU, IIM Bangalore, and University of Western Australia. And it is funded by iWage, IMB, and UNU Widers, and APU as well. So now I want to talk about what was our survey instrument. So this was just one part of the survey instrument specifically to understand the what is being asked question. So every time we went to a household, our enumerator would randomly select one adult male and one adult female from the household. And each of this in the respondent, so that was our respondent pair from a household, and each of them were interviewed separately. So we had one interview for the male respondent, one interview for the female respondent. Now, one part of the survey, which was to really get at the employment estimates, was we asked about their weekly activity status. So as some of you may be aware, how the weekly activity status is typically collected in our national periodic labor force surveys is a simple question of what did you do in the last week for at least 1 hour. Right? So it's a sort of a one broad question. We took a little slightly different approach, and instead of asking an overarching question, we asked actually six separate questions about different kinds of employment. So for example, the first question that we asked was, last week, did you do any kind of business, farming, or other self-employed activity to generate income, even if only for 1 hour? So the 1 hour criterion is coming from ILO's definition of employment. So we would ask them so this is essentially identifying if they were self-employed or not. If they said yes to it, then we went on to collect information on their earnings, hours of work, the industry, occupation, and so on. Then the second question we asked was, last week, did you assist without pay in a business or farm or livestock of a household or family member? So this is your contributing family worker or an unpaid family worker. Note that this is not domestic care work. This is actually economic employment work, except that they do not get a direct salary or reimbursement, but they contribute to the overall earnings or profit of their farm or business. So they are sort of indirectly reimbursed. Then we had another third calling out question where we asked, did you work for wage, salary, or commission, or any payment in kind, including doing paid domestic work? So this was our wage employment. Then we also had a question to get at, did you do any small scale production of goods? Actually, it's only goods at home, not services. So this is again consistent with ILO's definition of work. And besides these 4 questions, we also asked questions on whether they did paid internship or apprenticeship. And we also had finally a recovery question, which is to say, well, were there other things in the last week which you maybe have missed out, right? So what I wanted to point out here is that we are explicitly calling out different kinds of employment activities rather than asking a broad question of, did you work last week, right? And we'll see how this comes into play in the measurement of employment. So besides our main survey, in the Karnataka field, we also had an experiment arm that ran on the site. So the experiment had actually got two sub-samples. Again, we use the same, we would have our household selected, where we randomly selected one adult male and adult female. In the one arm of this experiment, what we did was we just asked one question. In the last week, what were the activities you were doing for at least an hour? So note here, we've remained within a week framework, but instead of asking detailed questions, we've just asked one question, right? So it's just a simple question. What did you do last week in at least for an hour? The other arm, so any household would be either getting arm 1 or arm 2. No household gets both the arms. So we would randomly assign either one of these arms. So the main survey is a different sample, arm 1 is a different sample, and arm 2 is a different sample. Okay? And in arm 2, what the households were asked about was, what were the activities you were doing on this day for at least an hour? So what we did here is that the last week, that we asked them about every day in the last week. So in the 7th day, the 6th day, 4th day, 5th day, 3rd day, 2nd day, 1 day of the last week, we asked them day by day, what were the activities that they did. So note here that the difference, what we're doing here is that we are still asking only one overarching question on what did you do, but instead of asking about the week in general, we are splitting it into days of the week, right? So there's a tweak in terms of the reference period, but it's still a single question framework. So if you compare the main survey, which is what I showed earlier, with arm 1, what we are getting is what is the value added or the change in employment estimates if you move from a detailed question to a single question, because that's the difference between your main survey and arm 1, right? You've just gone from detailed question to a single question. If you compare between arm 1 and arm 2, you can get at what is the estimate difference when you ask again a single question, but you're changing the reference period. You're, instead of asking about a week in general, you're asking about each day of the last week. So the first comparison will get us the increments in asking detailed questions versus a single question. The second, the arm 1 to arm 2 comparison can get us what is the increment in changing the reference period and making a more narrow and detailed reference period questions. So that was the what part, what is being asked. That is what we wanted to look at, and how we looked at it from this survey through these various tweaks in our survey instrument. Then to answer the who is being asked, what we did was, like I said, in every household, we had an adult male and an adult female. Now it could be, and this was not by design, it could be that the adult male and female were husband and wife pairs. Now, if they were husband and wife pairs, then what we did was we would ask the husband about his wife's work, and we would ask the wife about her husband's work. So that's where we bring in the self versus proxy reporting. So like you saw earlier, where we asked last week, did you do any kind of business or farming? That would be asked both to the man and the woman about their own work. Just like that, we would ask them, if the chosen woman and husband were actually spouses, we would ask, last week, did your spouse do any kind of business, farming, or self-employed activity? So each of these questions that you saw earlier about self-employment, wage work, unpaid family work would be asked about themselves, but we would also ask them to tell, well, did your spouse do this, all of these 3 or 4 types of work, right? And if they said yes to any activity, then again, for both the self and the proxy, we would ask about the number of days and the hours worked in that activity. And the reason that we maintained this only for a spousal pair was that we wanted to make sure that, at least to the extent that the information asymmetry is minimized between a couple, we just wanted to say, well, even when information asymmetry is potentially minimized, is there still a difference in self versus proxy reporting? But you could have the survey designed in such a way that you actually ask any pair. It need not be a spousal pair. So the results broadly on who is being asked, right? So what I have here, so if you look at the, so workforce participation rate, your employment rate, which is the share who report as working in the total working age population. As you can see here, when men report about themselves, then for the sample, the overall employment rate is about 76%. Proxy here indicates that when the wives are reporting about men, so when wives are reporting about men and you identify how many men are working as reported by their wives, we get an employment rate of men of around 77.5%. So there's not much difference between self-reported estimates and proxy-reported estimates, about 1.4, and it's not significant. Now, when women report about themselves, then about 60% of women are saying that they are employed. But when their husbands report about their wives, only 53 or 54% of husbands are saying that their wives are working. So for around 6%, there's a sort of disagreement. So the women are saying that they are working, but their husbands do not identify them as working in the proxy reporting framework. And you can see that this difference is significant, and it comes through for both the employment rate as well as the labor force participation rate. So there itself, I mean, you can see that clearly that when men are reporting about women, there is a clear underreporting, which doesn't seem to happen the other way. Women are able to get accurately advanced employment. We also, like I said, had asked about the hours of work, right? So the unconditional hours basically means that we are including everybody. So even if somebody said they're not working, we would put their hours of work as 0. And if somebody said they're working, we would actually use that actual hours of work. So in the unconditional sample, women would typically say that in a week they work about 19 hours, whereas their husbands would say that they work around 16 or 17 hours. So there is again an underreporting of the hours worked. But then if you go to a conditional sample where you're only limiting it to the instances where women say they are working and you take the average hours of work, husbands say that their wives are working, and only for those working wives you take the average hours of work, then there's actually no difference. So what this means is that you can look at this in terms of an extensive margin and intensive margin question, which is that men at the extensive margin in terms of reporting women's employment, they are underreporting women's employment. But if men recognize women as being in employment, they are able to more or less accurately get the hours that they undertake in work. So it is at the intensive margin, there doesn't seem to be an underreporting of women's employment. So we also did some heterogeneity of these results just to see how consistent this were across subsamples. And from now on, I'm actually only going to be focusing on the women's side of the story, because again, like I said, for men, we don't see any significant underreporting. What you find is that its underreporting is significant for women who are between 31 to 40 years. And this is typically the age group where most women, if at all they are employed, they are likely to be employed in this age group. It is more so for the less educated women. And interestingly, we found that if you are to differentiate your households in terms of the poorest, the medium rich, and then the richest households based on asset ownership, this underreporting is actually occurring at two ends of the asset group. So it's coming from the poorest households as well as the richest households. And we'll investigate this further in terms of what this implies. We also did some simple robustness checks of this underreporting. I'm not going to spend too much time, but I'm happy to discuss this in the discussion. We had a simple OLS model where we said that the dependent variable basically takes the value 1 if somebody is reported as employed, and 0 otherwise. And then your control is whether the report or the report is coming from the self or from the proxy. And what this says, at least the OLS is saying that if in the case of the female sample, if something is proxy reported, so this is the coefficient of the proxy variable. If something is reported by a proxy, then women's employment is likely to be underreported by about 6 percentage points. And this is consistent even in an individual fixed effects model. So we also did a model with fixed effects for at the individual level, and you find that these results are remarkably robust. So there is a consistent 6% underestimation of women's work by men. Now, because we had these, specific questions about different kinds of work, it's also possible for us to say, well, what is the kind of work that is being underreported? So overall, there is a workforce participation underreporting, but is there specific kinds of work that are more susceptible to being underreported? So this is a similar framework in the estimation framework, as I mentioned earlier. What we have is in the self-employed, for example, the dependent variable takes the value 1 if somebody is either reported as being self-employed or they themselves report as self-employed. And then on your control of interest is whether that report is coming from a self-report or if it's coming from a proxy report. So the control variable will take the value 1 if it's coming from a proxy. So what this is saying, which is the positive coefficient is actually saying, is that proxy, if an estimate is proxy reported, then women's self-employment is actually likely to be over-reported. Okay, so women are likely to be over-reported in self-employment, whereas it is their wage work and unpaid family work which is being underreported. So this adds a further insight to the overall underreporting. So what we are seeing is that it's not a sort of a monotonic relation where all kinds of work that women do are being underreported, but rather certain kinds of work, specifically wage work, which is your salaried or casual wage work, or unpaid family work, which is helping in the family, farm, or business. These are the kinds of work that are systematically underreported. In fact, men tend to overreport women in self-employment. And so there's some mixing up happening in a sense that where women are actually saying that, well, we are not self-employed, we are unpaid family work. And there is a certain fuzziness in those boundaries of work. Again, when we do this heterogeneity, we are then finding that the underreporting of wage work that we saw was coming in from the poorest households, whereas the underreporting of unpaid that we saw was coming from the richest household. So basically what this then does, what I then, when we looked at further, was to try and find what are some mechanisms that can in a sense explain this underreporting of these different kinds of work. So we had a simple multinomial logit model. And what we do here is that, so for any kind of employment, what could happen is that the husband and wives can agree on that kind of employment, or husbands could underreport women's employment, or husbands could misattribute, which is to say that the wife says she's self-employed, the husband says that she's working, but then she doesn't identify her as self-employed. He probably identifies her as an unpaid family worker. And this is what we call misattribution. So there, the problem is that men are not underreporting women's work, but rather they're mixing up the kind of activities that's being reported. So there are these three possible outcomes that can happen in the self versus proxy comparisons. So what we did was a simple multinomial logit estimation to see what is it that can explain some of this agreement and underreporting. So we have a number of controls here. This is basically individual specific or respondent specific controls, which include their age, education. It also has the proxy's age and education. And then we have some household specific controls like the household asset ownership, household structure. What is the respondent's predominant yearly activity? So we had asked in part of the questionnaire, what did you do for the majority of the year? We also have a control to see if they're in agricultural work or not, and also whether the husband reported the mother as working. And I can explain some of the logic behind some of this later. Since we had found earlier that this underreporting was significant in the case of wage work in poorest households and unpaid work in richest households, we specifically modeled the underreporting of wage work as a function of all of these various correlates that I mentioned earlier. And similarly, the underreporting of unpaid work in richest households also modeled as a function of various correlates. And what we are finding is that the underreporting of wage work in the poorest households is coming. What explains this is if the woman's predominant activity, that is her yearly activity, is that of being out of the workforce. So if the woman is predominantly out of the workforce and this wage work that she reported is probably done only interspersively and only maybe in that week, that is when the underreporting is likely to happen. So if the woman is a marginal worker, they are more likely to be underreported. And so the poorest household underreporting of wage work may potentially be coming from the asymmetric information error that Ambler had identified, that husbands do not often see the women in that work, the work is often marginal, and it's not sort of consistently undertaken throughout the year, and that's why they are underreporting them as work. Now, in the case of unpaid work in the richest household, where we saw that there was again an underreporting, the mechanism is actually quite different. What is turning out significant in explaining the underreporting of unpaid work in the richest household is these two factors. One is if the husband has reported his mother as employed, then he's more likely to agree on women's employment. So there's sort of something like um, a social norms and cognitive bias coming here, that if the mother or this woman's mother-in-law or if the husband's mother was actually working, if he had said that she was working, then those kinds of husbands are more likely to agree that their wives are also in paid employment. Similarly, we also find that the autonomy index, which basically captures if women have a say in basic decision making in the household, we find that women with better say and better participation in decisions in the household are also more likely to have spousal agreement on their employment. So in the case of underreporting of unpaid work in the richest households, rather than an asymmetric information error, this points towards something like an asymmetric measurement error, that there may be some cognitive biases. So the kind of husbands who are reporting women as employed are ones who are okay with reporting their mothers as employed. And also it's also likely more in the case of women who themselves have greater autonomy. So it could be coming potentially from sort of not conforming from larger social norms kind of perspective. Okay. So that kind of is our sort of initial findings from the question of who is being asked. So just to kind of bring it together is that there is significant underreporting, but it's not consistently that all kinds of work is being underreported. Specific kinds of work are being underreported, and in fact, self-employment, for example, is actually being overreported for women. And some of these mechanisms allude to the fact that on the one hand, there is asymmetric information error, but there is also partially some kind of larger norms and cognitive biases at play as well. Then the last question that we looked at was the what is being asked, right? So we had the experiment and the main survey. So what you have here is the employment rate from the weekly estimates for women. So if you remember the detailed weekly questions, we use that, we can get that the employment rate for women is around 56%. In the experiment arm, where we asked just a single weekly question, what did you do last week? Just one question, the employment rate falls to 44%. And if we asked again a single question, but not about the week, but day by day single questions, then the employment rate is at 53. Now, what we are finding is that when you statistically compare these different employment estimates, we are finding that there's a significant improvement when you move from a single weekly question to a detailed weekly question. So that this improvement from 44 to 56 is significant. Whereas when you move in terms of the different reference period, moving from a single weekly to a single daily, multiple daily questions, this improvement is not statistically significant, right? But so this actually asking and calling out each kinds of work seems to statistically really bump up women's workforce estimates. I must clarify that none of this affects men's estimates in any way. So across all of these arms, whether it's the main survey, experiment 1 or experiment 2, men's work is almost identical. And so we also have, although the survey is not, the Karnataka and Rajasthan samples were not comparable, we looked at the PLFS, the Periodic Labor Force Survey estimates of workforce participation for the certain specified districts that we had completed the survey in. So the blue line is what the official estimates of employment are, and the red line is from our survey. Right. So for Karnataka and Rajasthan, for Rajasthan, there is some difference, which is a little strange, but more or less men's overall employment rate, it doesn't seem to make a huge difference between the PLFS and IWS. But when you look at women's work, you can see that there's nearly a doubling, more than a doubling of women's work that our survey is getting at, because of all these different tweaks that we have, right? Both asking the women themselves, but also having these detailed weekly questions. So for example, in Karnataka, for those districts that we went to, the employment rate from PLFS was around 37%, but the IWS will tell you an employment rate of 59%. And actually, just to bring in one more survey that is being done, which is the CMIA survey. CMIA will put all of these employment estimates much lower. So it's about 10% employment for women. So broadly, so CMIA starts at 10% employment rate for women, PLFS would give you around 20 to 25, and then IWS estimates give you around anywhere between 55 to 60%. So you have these huge differences across women's employment estimates, which points towards the challenges in measuring women's work and the need for really much more careful work on capturing women's employment. So broadly, there are many factors at play in the measurement of women's work. And what we are finding, of course, speaking with women directly can increase the employment estimates. But it is not to say that, every survey must adhere to actually speaking to respondents directly. Often it's impossible to do that. But what we need to keep in mind is that whatever estimates that are coming are potentially lower bounds of women's employment. We also finding that specifically calling out different kinds of activities, which in a sense is kind of implementable in many surveys, can really get at a better understanding of the kinds of work that women do, as well as the multiple kinds of activities that women are engaged in. Besides these, and these are sort of conjectures that we have because we can't really test these, we do believe that the extensive enumerator training that we did and the sensitization that we did prior to the survey, which is to talk to them about different kinds of women's employment and the likely biases that they themselves as enumerators may have when capturing women's work, and alerting to them to that could also have come into play in terms of measurement of women's work. Another sort of thing another innovation that we did with this was that in every household, we had both a male-female enumerator visit, and only female enumerators will speak to female respondents, male enumerators would speak to male respondents. And we believe perhaps that pairing also, and also trying to make sure that women were spoken to in private, could also have had a role to play in potentially getting better estimates of women's employment. Yeah, so I think that kind of concludes. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this enlightening talk. It was very good. So now we will request questions from the audience. So someone has posted some question in the chat box. Could you read it?
Sure. Yeah. So thanks for the question. So I'll just read it out. So thanks for sharing this insightful and fascinating study. Does IWS study include the survey questions that might find differences in reporting about the drudgery involved in gendered roles in the work market or self-employed? Forgive me if the question of drudgery is not part of your IWS study. I'm new to development discipline. I find the study is exciting because in our study about soil stewardship activities, relatively women than men are implicitly aware about the level of drudgery involved in cultivating high slope landscapes. Women prefer not to cultivate in high slope landscapes. Preference of women are well aligned with ecological goals that aim at reducing soil erosion in high slopes. Yeah, no, I think it's a very specific question. So no, we did not really look at questions around drudgery involved in gender roles in the work market. What we did kind of get at, and I don't know if this maybe addresses some part of your question, is um, for women who were out of the workforce, we did ask them questions on, well, would you like to work? And if you would like to work, what is the kind of work that you would do? And for almost 60% of women who are not working, they expressed that they would like to work. But and for also for women who were in the workforce, we also asked them questions around their experiences of work. But I don't think we kind of got exactly at drudgery. We tried to get at what are the kind of is there sort of identity-based harassment or discrimination that they face at work, whether it's in terms of self-employment or in the wage work. But interestingly, we didn't get a lot of responses, but that it's also coming from the fact that it is quite a sensitive question to ask. And perhaps that's not the right way to go about collecting that information. But yeah, I think, I don't know if that answers, but yeah, we didn't have much about drudgery as such. I think it's an important point specifically because we often just talk about bringing women into the workforce without really talking about what that work is. Um, and I think the drudgery question is really well addressed in a piece by Professor Padmini Swaminathan, which is a MIDS working paper on the trauma of wage work. She talks about they profile textile workers in various locations around Tamil Nadu and describes how really drudgerous and painful that work is. And sometimes I think some of the discourse on bringing women into employment needs to also look at questions around drudgery and unsuitable workplace conditions.
Thank you. There is another question from Gargi. Interesting work, Dr. Rosa. I was wondering how impactful education levels of husbands were in recognizing women's work. We do see instances from literature stating that literate men were shown to be more egalitarian in relationships and marriages in general. You did mention that your sample was mostly rural, so I'm wondering if similar variations could be seen for an urban sample, which usually clear forms of paid employment for both women and men. So,
Yeah, thanks for that question. Actually, so I should have mentioned is that what we are seeing in terms of the richest household and the poorest household underreporting, we're seeing similar things when you look at highly educated husbands and illiterate husbands. So husbands in the middle who are sort of primary and middle educated, they don't significantly underreport women's work. The underreporting is really happening by husbands who are either highly educated or less educated. And this also correlates with the wage work underreporting and the unpaid work underreporting. So the wage work underreporting, which is happening in poor households, which are also correlated with households where husbands are less educated, is probably coming from an asymmetric information. So in fact, I would count, I mean, what we are saying is unlike what you are kind of hypothesizing, it's likely that when husbands are highly educated, which means that they're also coming from high income households, those are the kind of households that want to adhere to a social norm that their wives are not working, that their wives are not in paid employment. And so those are the kind of households that tend to maybe underreport women's work, which is what we are finding, that unpaid work by women in these rich households is being underreported, which rich households means that the husbands are also highly educated in those households. So actually, there is a sort of adherence to social norms which you see at the higher end, which brings about an underreporting of women's work. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have any. We have some urban sample, but not enough for us to make many conclusive statements. But it's definitely something interesting to look at. So the Kapoor paper that I cited was a purely urban sample-based paper, and they are finding that there is an underreporting of women's work by husbands. They don't find huge differences by the education of the husband, but what they do find is that there's a huge educational difference between the husband and the wife. Then that can explain underreporting, which probably also means that again it's highly educated husbands again underreporting women's work.
thank you. Any other question? I have a couple of questions. One is that, see, basically, so when you do the interview with individuals, do you ensure that the presence of other individual is also there, or you do it exclusively with individuals? Because survey researchers like Dale Whittington, they argue that when we try to measure the preferences, especially within the intra-household context, we need to kind of allow the members of the households to kind of talk to each other and share their kind of views about the questions being asked. So that is supposed to be providing a kind of a more valid and reliable information than the kind of information being given by the individuals in the absence of other individuals in the household. So I want to know whether you have tried this arm also. For example, asking questions to males in the absence of females, asking questions to females in the absence of males, and asking questions to any one of them in the presence of the other partner actually. So this third arm would have also given a kind of, some result which could have been compared with the two other results actually. The second one is that, see, the underreporting of wage work by the poor. It may be also due to strategic bias, because sometimes the poor families are concerned about their income being used for some of the government programs, right? So they may think that in case they reveal their true income, then their PDS supply will be cut, or some of the other welfare programs may be cut. This is purely a kind of strategic kind of behavior that affects the information being provided by the poorer family, especially in relation to income, right?
Yeah, no, thanks. I think just coming to the second question first, I think that's a great point, actually, something that we didn't think about. Yeah, that it is not really, could be that it is a strategic and it's not an asymmetric information, and they don't want to share that there is an all second source of income from the wives, and they do withhold that. Yeah, that I guess there's no way for us to kind of test that, but it's definitely something that we will caveat when we write up these results. So on the first thing of did we speak to them in private? So actually, with the IWS, our stated intention and our stated protocol for the survey and for our enumerators was that we would have private conversations with husbands and private conversations with wives. So the reason at that point why we wanted private conversations is, again, we didn't want these kind of third party norms and third party responses to affect women's, especially women's reporting. That we also had asked certain sensitive questions on desire to work and facing sort of uh, unpleasant situations as well, right? So we wanted to note some of this in private, and which is we had this clear thing that we didn't want other people to bias responses. But of course, I mean, I'm sure you're probably far more aware of this, that it's in villages, it's almost next to impossible to get a private conversation. So almost every households that we went to, especially for women, we always ended up speaking to a woman who would be surrounded by 3, 4 other women who would be laughing and joking and also nudging. Little bit of nudging of answers would happen. So yeah, it was only in theory that we wanted it private, but there's, of course, I can't say that it was kind of always be private. So actually what we did was, in our enumerator in our survey instrument, we also made sure that the enumerator coded whether this was actually done in private or not. So we can kind of control for this, but what we can't control is if the other members that were present were other men and other women, or who they were, we can't control for. But I think that is definitely something for us to bring in when we look at these estimates. Yeah.
So any other question, please? Others? No other question. If there is no other question, then Prasanna, can we close it? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay. So thank you, Dr. Rosa. Thank you very much for this very, very interesting kind of study. Indeed, I was always looking for this kind of literature, actually, especially the literature that critically looks at the methodology of kind of generating primary data, especially in the Indian context. We have plenty of kind of factors affecting the validity and reliability of the data that we collect from the through primary surveys. But usually econometricians assume that when we introduce this error term in the equation, so that will take care of all those things, which is not true actually, right? So therefore, I'm really thankful for getting into these kinds of very important studies, and I think that this study would definitely contribute to the existing literature, especially on primary surveys in the Indian context. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you,
Thank you
Professor
all.
Venkatachalam. Thank you, and Dr. Rosa Abraham. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you all.